The last video I made was an introduction to Casanova's autobiography called Histoire de ma vie, History of My Life. And I just discussed it as an argument to encourage you to read the book. It's a good book. It's an underrated book. He was a great writer and thinker, as well as all the stereotypes and the reputation that we know of him. Now I'm just going to have a bit of a deep dive into the preface, which is one of the real masterpieces of writing of the work. And it explains, it's his argument about who he is and why he justifies you, the reader, reading the book. So I start with the first line because it's a great first line. He says, "I begin by declaring to my reader that by everything good or bad that I have done throughout my life, I am sure that I have earned merit or incurred guilt, and that hence I must consider myself a free agent." And on the same spirit, he goes on to say, man is a free agent. But he is not free if he does not believe it. For the more power he attributes to destiny, the more he deprives himself of the power which God granted him when he gave him reason. So both of those thoughts, those sentences, are Casanova justifying his, as it were, his right to be free and his right to use his own reason, whether or not granted by God, who he does say he believes in, although I think certainly not in a kind of organised religion sense. And indeed, he quotes Petrarch describing how you should pray, and he says that you should pray with the knees of the mind bent. So you can see from that he's not interested in the organised religion idea. If you really believe, you need to literally get on your knees. It's much more an attitude or a state of mind, which relates, of course, to his belief that he's been given his independence and his reason by God. So it's very much an internal attitude rather than a performance of action or gestures. But that given his capacity to accept responsibility for the guilt that he has incurred through the bad things he's done, to enjoy himself from the good things that he's done, and with a baseline idea that God has given him freedom, therefore he is free to do as he sees fit. And it's a very liberating idea, this. And it's also an argument against what you might call kind of karmic moral responsibility to behave in a certain way all the time. In fact, some of the evidence, you might say, for this idea is that he describes how he's had both good and bad luck in what he's done. So he says this: "My ill fortune, no less than my good, proved to me that both in this physical world and in the moral world, good comes from evil, as evil comes from good. My errors will show thoughtful readers these opposite roads, or will teach them the great art of straddling the ditch. The one thing necessary is courage, for strength without confidence is useless." Just pausing there for a moment. That's such a wonderful thing, and you feel that when you read it, that he's fearless in his actions. He makes a lot of decisions quickly, acts on them, and he gets through an incredible amount of experiences, an incredible amount of execution of his ideas, which is really an inspiring thing. And he goes on, "I've often seen good fortune fall in my lap as the result of some incautious step, which should have cast me into the abyss. And though I blamed myself, I thank God. On the other hand, I've also seen an overwhelming misfortune follow upon a course of conduct duly weighed by prudence. I was humiliated, but sure that I had been right, I soon consoled myself." So this is his argument against being too hesitant based on what he describes as the good and evil of the moral world or of the physical world. Less obvious what he means by that. But of course, in general, he was also, as I said before, he was also a gambler as well as a lover, and probably a card shark, and in many ways a scammer, what you might call now, as well as being very honest and also doing a lot of good as he goes through life. One of the things he said, as I said before, is he tried to leave people better off after having met him, and that is almost exclusively the case, not quite. And these arguments he's just made are really about his right to make his own choices based on courage and based on knowledge that if you use reason, things may go well, things may not go well, but they are not determined by this idea of if you always do the right thing, then the right thing will happen to you, and if you do the wrong thing, then the wrong thing will happen to you, which is very much a kind of teleological, causative idea that we probably subscribe more to now, and it's certainly connected to our capitalist ideas that if you work hard, things will definitely work out. Quite clearly not the case. And he has a much more independent approach, which I also, as I say, I think it's liberating to read, and it leads to a lot of fun and escapades. And indeed, he talks about his pleasures that he gets. Cultivating whatever gave me pleasure to my senses was always the chief business of my life. I have never found any occupation more important. Feeling that I was born for the sex opposite to mine, I've always loved it and done all that I could to make myself loved by it. I've also been extravagantly fond of good food and irresistibly drawn by anything which could excite curiosity. I think his curiosity is very much at the forefront, and he is a lover. And part of his character, as he says to himself, is to be loved and to be appreciated. And indeed, he quotes Ovid saying, "Having an audience makes one try harder. Virtue grows by praise, and fame is a powerful spur." So he's acknowledging something which maybe, again, we don't want to acknowledge so much now, which is that it is really important to be appreciated and wanted and loved by people that you're trying to make an impact on, and that you're in a way motivated through things like curiosity, or through things like love. And he has something to say about subjects of this, so the other people that he has an impact on, and in particular because he's a bit of a scammer and a seducer, but in particular a scammer, he has this to say about the people who he scams. "You will laugh when you discover that I often had no scruples whatsoever about deceiving nitwits and scoundrels and fools when I found it necessary. As for women, this sort of reciprocal deceit cancels itself out, for when love enters in, both parties are usually dupes." He's then going to argue that we really should actually take advantage of people who you might call fools. So he says, "We avenge intelligence when we deceive a fool, and the victory is worth the effort, for a fool is encased in armour, and we do not know where to attack him. In short, deceiving a fool is an exploit worthy of an intelligent man." He distinguishes fools from something else he describes as people who are stupid. And he says, "Since stupidity is due to lack of education, I rather like them. I have found some of them, stupid people in his definition, who were very decent, and whose stupidity was almost a kind of wit." I think you can see in that he's not a judgmental person on the whole. I think that it's his right to give people what's coming to them. I think that's the way he looks at it. And indeed, he makes an extraordinary argument in favour of the essentially money that he's won and stolen from other people. They, that's my friends. When he says my friends, he means those of you who are reading, he would like to become friends, as in he wants his readers to be his friends. He says, "I expect the friendship, the esteem, and the gratitude of my readers." And he goes on, "They will not condemn me when they see me emptying my friends' purses to satisfy my whims." They, the friends whose purses he emptied, they were possessed by chimerical projects, and by making them hope for their success, I, at the same time, hoped to cure them of their folly by opening their eyes. I deceived them to make them wise, and I did not consider myself guilty, because what I did was not prompted by avarice. This idea of deceiving them to make them wise comes back again and again here, and also in other kind of wise texts, which is that experience has a cost. That is, it's one of Aesop's fables, isn't it? That it's the fox and the crow, I think, where the fox flatters the crow, and the crow drops the food out of its mouth, which the fox eats, and he says, "Consider this food the cost of your lesson to not take flattery to heart," something like this. So this idea that being duped is actually a lesson that you pay for in the duping. He goes on, "I was simply paying for my pleasures with money allotted to acquiring possessions which nature makes it impossible to obtain. I should consider myself guilty if I were a rich man today. I have nothing. Whatever I had, I have squandered, and this consoles and justifies me." Don't know if that reminds anybody of the footballer George Best saying, "Most of my money I spent on women and booze, and the rest I squandered." It was money which was to be spent on follies. I merely changed its application by making it pay for mine. It's a little bit abstruse what he means, but he, being a kind of scammer who spent his whole life living on his wits, he was constantly coming up with schemes, or winging it basically, and making schemes to get money from people who were willingly entering into what he calls his own chimerical projects. And as he said, his projects, nature makes it impossible to obtain. The money was therefore allotted to be wasted, and all he did was change the application to be he himself was the one who was squandering it. It's an extraordinary justification. Make of it what you will. As an adventurer, he survived on his wits, great escapades on his wits, and I think he felt that everybody else was entitled to do the same thing on their wits. And if they sometimes got money from him, good for them, and if he succeeded mostly in getting money from them, good for him. I hope to make some videos about some of these extraordinary scams that he did, because there is, when he talks about dupes, in terms of these fools that he scammed, I mean, one of the big scams that he did repeatedly was that he was a kind of alchemical seer who had numerological skills and who could read the future. And he kind of invented systems of prophecy, of course, always to his own advantage. He's really acknowledging that, of course, no one should have followed these ideas. And when he talks about women being, he said, in love, not so much women, but in love, the deceit cancels itself out, because in love, both parties are dupes. And the first line I read here, I didn't read it, in fact, but just before this passage I read, he says, "They will find," his friends, "will find that I've always loved truth so passionately that I've often resorted to lying as a way of first introducing it into minds which were ignorant of its charms." He means by saying minds that are ignorant of its charms, he's referring to, if it's in terms of love, he's referring to women who, from a sense of duty or religious piety, see their own feelings of love to him, which he can see as stirred up, as being sinful or that should be repressed. Whereas I think his opinion is that, of course, love is something that should be celebrated and is in fact the kind of highest gift that God gives, and that God would never seek to cause people displeasure. So when he says he lies in order to introduce them to the truth, is that he is, depending what the lie is, I mean, that's not a consistent thing, but maybe he will somehow scheme in order for them to give in to loving him. And then he's able to say and exculpate himself by saying that the deceit is on both sides, because he really does love them, and he is heartbroken almost every single time there's been some end to a love situation. And of course, I should say that often here he's referring to nuns, or people, women in a nunnery, or girls in a nunnery. You have to bear in mind that that was not a choice, and often girls were sent to nunneries for having done something shameful, or for having had a child out of wedlock, or something which nowadays we would not consider to be so problematic. But then girls were sent to a nunnery almost in order to cure them of love. And so in a way he's battling, his view is that he's battling against that institutionalization, trying to give them their independence back, trying to open their eyes to something which can give them great pleasure and great love, albeit everybody is duped by it. Again, make of that what you will, but you can't say it isn't courageous, and it isn't liberated and liberating as well. I wanted to mention something he says about character, and it's related to this idea of courage. He says something very funny, I think, which he says, I've concluded that my conduct has depended more on my character than on my mind. After a long struggle between them, in which I have alternately found myself with too little intelligence for my character and too little character for my intelligence. I think it's very interesting, the idea that you can get stuck between having too much character and not enough intelligence, and too much intelligence and not enough character or courage. So I think character represents something like personality. We might use the word personality now, where so much intelligence, you think too much, your personality is not strong enough to actually make a life or make a choice out of itself. Or times when you act so much from instantaneous pleasure-seeking personality or courage or excitement that your intelligence gets left behind and you do something foolish. I think before I bring it to a halt, I just mentioned that he's writing this at the end of his life. He's probably in his 70s when he writes most of the book, and he's looking back over what it was like to have been a young man, and it's a very moving thing to read his reflections about loss and his reflections about how memory and the power of memory and the loss caused by memory. He mentions it here, death and his fear of death, or his lack of fear of death, is quite a big part of the preface. And he likes to say, I know, in an argument against Cartesian dualism, he's saying, I know that I'm alive because I feel. Of course, Descartes says, I think, therefore I am. Casanova says, I feel, therefore I am. And after he dies, if he no longer feels, then it doesn't matter anymore, he says. And if he still feels something after he dies, he says, then he would have to argue that he was not dead. Finally, just to quote his last line, because I think it's very beautiful. He says, for my part, this is the last line of the preface, for my part, since I've always admitted that I was the chief cause of all the misfortunes which have befallen me, I have rejoiced in my ability to be my own pupil, and in my duty to love my teacher. We often think of this idea of how important it is to be your own pupil, which is to say, to learn from your own mistakes, to learn from your experience. And actually learning from experience is much more difficult to do than you might imagine. And what we tend to do as people is repeat our failures rather than learn from them. And his way of twisting the tables in this kind of sophistical argument is to say, if you can learn from yourself, then by definition you are your own teacher. And the way that a pupil learns from the teacher is that the pupil loves the teacher. So learning from yourself and loving who you are, in a way, two sides of the same coin. The ability to love yourself may be just as difficult as the ability to learn from yourself. I think it's clear from this that he's full of insight, full of almost therapeutic levels of self-awareness and self-reflection that we can all learn from. So that's my summary of the preface to Casanova's History of My Life. Thanks for watching.